As wildlife photographers, we want to get the best photos possible of creatures at close range, and often this can lead to us having to not only find animals but also stalk them. And quite often this is a challenge that many wildlife photographers face, because as soon as you get close enough, the animal will get spooked and fly away. So today we're going to be talking about how to find and track and then get close to animals without disturbing them in their natural habitat. Now, wildlife photography is unpredictable, so everything in this video are tips. It's a rough guide, but only you know the animal that you're photographing when you're out in the field. So take this as an umbrella, a guide that you can use when out doing wildlife photography. When we think about the world that we live in, there's often two categories. There's rural and there's urban. There's country and there's city. And often when we're out doing wildlife photography in the rural and in the countryside settings, we want to take techniques that would work in the city. There's a boldness, a bigness, a vibrantness in the city that we want to take with us. However, when we're in the countryside approaching wildlife, we want to be small, discreet. We want to go unnoticed. And so in this video, I'm going to talk about three main things that you can do to help you ethically get close to and take pictures of animals when out in the countryside. We're going to talk about how you present yourself, how you behave, and then how the wildlife behaves. So jumping straight into the first point. How do you present yourself when doing wildlife photography? You'll often see pictures of wildlife photographers or in documentaries where they're in all of this crazy camouflaged gear, and there is a purpose to this. If you blend in with the scenery, you're more likely to go unnoticed, and that means when you're out doing wildlife photography, the wildlife is less likely to get spooked by you. The best technique for getting really close to wildlife would be to observe the wildlife, find out where it is, and then wear appropriate camouflage and put yourself in a position where you know the wildlife will be and you can hide in the bushes or the grass, say. Now, often something you'll see on documentaries behind the scenes on like Planet Earth and all these David Attenborough films is that if they're going to get a photo of an Arctic fox, they'll dress up in snow camouflage. And then they won't just confidently walk out and sit where they want to go at their own convenience, but instead, they'll put the wildlife first. They'll go, it's their habitat, and we don't want to disturb them. So in order to get there for the time that they want the photos, they'll schedule 3 hours beforehand. They'll go while it's still dark. They'll go undercover. They'll go before the wildlife gets there, so when the wildlife appears, they're not going to spook it or scare it away. The camouflage is important because it means once they're there, they can stay there unnoticed, and this will help the wildlife to have its natural routines kept, and it won't be scared. Now, as wildlife photographers, one of the many privileges of taking wildlife photos is bridging this gap between the wildlife that no one ever sees because it's super shy and cautious, and the beautiful pictures that you get to show people, and that can often be useful for conservation. Say, in the Arctic fox scenario, there are Arctic foxes and they're endangered, and we need to raise awareness for this Arctic fox. Going out, respecting the Arctic fox and taking pictures of the Arctic fox allows us to then share and help conservation for the Arctic fox. But what would be the point in promoting the conservation if we didn't treat the wildlife ethically? This is why it's so important to think about the wildlife that we are going and taking pictures of. Now, I live in the UK where there aren't too many endangered species. There are no Arctic foxes or tigers, and often I'll do my wildlife photography on footpaths and on canal paths, and these places where humans regularly walk all the time. Think about Bushy Park, for example. I go there quite often to take pictures of the deer. Now, the deer are completely used to people. They choose to come up to people. This allows me, as a wildlife photographer, to get unique shots of creatures that are used to having people around. So, if you can think of environments where the wildlife isn't spooked by people, it may even be your backyard, then making the most of those environments can help you get close to wildlife. Another thing you want to be aware of when you're presenting yourself will be your size. Now, as humans, we're quite large creatures, and if we're standing up, we're very tall. This means that if you're taking a picture of a bird on the floor, say, I took a picture a couple of months ago of a robin. The first crazy thing that happened was there was a robin on the path in front of me, and I lay down on the floor. I was stretched out across the path. Luckily, no one was coming, and we got some awesome photos because I was eye level with the robin. We have beautiful bokeh in the front and the back, the orange of the leaves on the path, some beautiful photos. So here are those photos. I got down on my stomach and slowly wiggled my way towards the bird. This meant that I had a very small profile. I didn't seem half as threatening as I would have done if I was standing up. Now, this was inconvenient. It got my clothes wet and muddy, and it meant that I had to do the rest of the trip trying not to brush the camera against the mud on my shirt. However, these are sacrifices that I'm willing to make in order to, one, not only get closer to the animal because it's not spooked, but also make sure I'm not disturbing the animals in their natural habitat. So think about your camouflage. Make sure you're blending into the environment. And secondly, don't be threatening. Sacrifice some of your own comfort to be a subtle presence in nature. It's wet rain. Second of all, your behavior. The way we behave is very important. When we're out with loads of equipment, say, we want to make sure we're not going to be irresponsible with that. So when we're setting up our camera gear, we want to make sure we're doing it in places not only that we're allowed to do it, so that'll be on public land or private land if you have permission. We also want to make sure we're doing it in a way that is safe for yourself and for nature. So we want to be setting up not inside a bush, for example. Sometimes I've seen wildlife photographers go and get right into bushes, and if you think a bush is a tree, okay, it's a plant. If you were cutting the branches off the plant, whilst I'm not going to advocate for it publicly, I wouldn't be too upset. We've got to think what's in those branches. There's insects which feed loads of the small birds who are also nesting in these bushes. So we need to make sure we're respecting nature, we're at least checking places before we set up our huge camera setups in those areas. We also want to make sure we're not being too loud, because nature will hear us. Nature is very sensitive. It can see us, it can hear us, and if you're doing mammals, you want to make sure you don't smell too strongly. If you want to get close, you need to make sure you're upwind. I think upwind is the right term. You want the wind to be blowing into you and have the animal in front of you. As I said, I believe it's upwind, but correct me in the comments if I'm wrong. And that means that the wildlife won't be able to smell you before you come. There are many mammals especially who have very keen senses of smell. And so by masking your smell, by directing yourself upwind of the animal, you can make sure you can get closer to the animal. So the way that we behave is very important. We don't want to be too loud. We don't want to be erratic. We don't want to be moving around too fast. If you see wildlife, a common mistake people can make is they can get so excited that they've just seen the red kite they want to take a picture of. They grab their camera, bring it up really quickly, and that erratic movement has scared away the bird. So you want to make sure you're calm. You almost want to practice and go, okay, if it comes, I'm going to slowly bring up my camera and adjust the settings as I do so. Use that time that you have to bring up your camera so that when you get ready to take the photo, you can take the photo. And wildlife doesn't stick around. The amount of times I've spent 10 minutes stalking an animal, I've been listening to the animal, I've been watching the animal, and then I've got within shot distance of the animal and it's flown away. You want to make sure that you have your camera settings on burst mode. You want a fast shutter speed. You want to make sure you are harnessing all of the equipment that you have to get the best shots. Finally, talking about equipment briefly, you can use an app to help you. There is an app called the Merlin app. I'm not sponsored in any way, but I love this Merlin app, and you can get it and record the sounds of birds around you, and it identifies the birds for you. I've got some little birds calling. The birds are still very high in the trees, but I've got my app out now. This is the Merlin app, And this tells us that the birds we were watching, although they were too far away to actually see, they were a common chiffchaff. We also had a chaffinch. So if you're in a field and you can hear a bunch of birds, but you don't know what birds you're hearing, you can use this app to identify the animals around you, and that will help you then act appropriately, knowing if it's a robin, you probably don't have to be quite as quiet. However, if it's a nightjar, you have to be super sensitive. And finally, we're going to talk about the animal's behavior and how important that is for understanding your approach to wildlife photography. You can find out how confident an animal is by its body language. So often you can tell how it's feeling and how it's going to react by how it shows itself. So with birds, for example, if you're walking through a field and you hear a high-pitched, screechy call, often it'll be a fast, repetitive, high-pitched call, that would be a warning call. Now, many birds' warning calls will sound pretty similar. And these warning calls are birds alerting all the birds, including potentially their partners and chicks, that there is a predator. When you hear that noise, you know that you've been spotted, meaning you have to be more cautious going forward, because as you keep going forward, the wildlife already knows you're there. It's on high alert. Quite often in this situation, you may just want to wait. You might just want to stand still for a while so the wildlife stops perceiving you as a threat. Similarly, if we go to deer, for example, deer have incredible hearing, and they have eyes on the sides of their head, meaning they can almost see 360 degrees around them. They're aware of you. You'll see their ears prick. They're listening to you. They can see you. And if they have their head up and they're standing on alert, they'll usually look at you. This would mean that you don't want to progress forward. If they've been startled by you and they're looking at you and you keep walking towards them, naturally they're going to try and leave. In my experience with deers, when they put their heads down to graze, that's when you want to approach. However, if there's a large herd of deer, there will always be one deer which is looking around ready to warn the others. And the last behavior I'm going to talk about is another bird behavior. Large birds, before they fly away, will often ruffle their feathers and maybe poo to lighten them and prepare them for flight. So if you're stalking or trying to get close to a bird of prey, you want to be watching for when it ruffles its feathers. If it starts ruffling its feathers, you know it's about to jump off, and that's when you want to make the most of getting a photo. However, if it looks very content and it's not ruffling its feathers, the chances are it doesn't plan on going anywhere. Now, as with all creatures, these behaviors are just a guide, and I'm no expert in animal behaviors. However, every time I go out, I get to know what the wildlife does in my local area, which is super helpful to do wildlife photography in the same place repetitively with the same species. You get to know their routines, their habits, their feeding sources, where they drink, where they nest, and this is going to help you to get close to the wildlife, but also understand when you should get close to the wildlife. We don't want to prioritize getting a photo over the welfare of the animals. We want to make sure that we're treating the animals with respect and we're not spooking them out of the area. If they get repetitively interfered with, they may look elsewhere to live. This is especially common when there are nests. When there are nests in spring, when there are ducklings, for example, give them space. Let's give the animals the space that they deserve. And a really helpful way of doing that is getting big lenses like this one up here. This is the Sigma 150 to 600mm lens, which is my go-to big lens. It helps me to zoom in to wildlife without having to disturb them. And the link to that will be in the description below. I've made so many reviews on it. Go check them out, hear what I have to say about it, and watch my vlogs where I use it. There's so much equipment. Binoculars, up on this side, where are they? There they are. These binoculars are gonna help you to observe wildlife from further away. Prepare yourself in the best way that you can. But what pleases me is that you're here learning how to take photos of wildlife ethically, that you're aware of the wildlife's welfare, that you want to be putting it first and you care about conservation. So I encourage you to keep going. Keep reading their behaviors, keep taking photos, and if you have any questions or comments, pop them in the comments below. I'll see you in the next one.